Alright, so today I'm going to shift gears from snakes over to breeding rodents, and specifically breeding rodents as a food source for your reptiles. And let me tell you, I produce an incredible amount of rodents, and in the last few months I really kind of dialed in some tips and tricks, and hopefully I'll share those with you, and hopefully you learned something and you'll walk away saying, hey, that was pretty cool. I actually learned something about breeding rodents. And I would say number one is probably the biggest thing that I've learned is when I feed these rodents, I actually use a Missouri 6F rodent breeder, and it comes kind of in a block, and it's really dusty actually. And when I first started putting it in the bins in the back of these racks over here, all the dust would fall through, and then I opened up the tub where the rats were, and I have all this dust in the back that fell down from the Missouri 6F. And what I started actually doing is using like one of those colanders you can buy like at the supermarket or the dollar store, you know, to kind of, you know, get the water out of your pasta, kind of the big round ones. And I use those to actually put the food in. I kind of shake it a little bit, all the dust falls to the bottom, and then I can load those up without the dust going into the rodent tub. And originally what I was doing is I was actually throwing that dust away because I couldn't find a use for it. And now check this out, I've actually been saving this Missouri 6F dust. So this is like the leftover dust from quite a few bags because I go through a lot of Missouri 6F, and I actually found this works fantastic as food for your crickets and your dubia roaches. Let me tell you, this is like almost a complete diet. I actually ran into it on the internet. Some guy was using it. He said this is all you need to feed your dubia roaches, and it's free. And you know, before what I was actually doing is I was putting in, you know, like oranges and a bunch of fruit and a bunch of stuff for my dubia roaches. And the problem is it was always molding and going bad, and I couldn't really find a good food source. I was actually buying some from the store. It was really expensive. And this stuff is totally free. Essentially what I do is I put a little dish of just the dry powder on one side of the tank, and then put water crystals on the other side, kind of hydrated water crystals. And my roaches seem like they're loving it. They just kind of pile up on the dried 6F powder and they eat it at night. It's pretty cool. So kind of the next thing is I've seen a lot of people thinking about breeding your own rodents, making your own rodent racks. And pretty much I'd say the universal way to breed and make your own rodent racks is to use concrete mixing tubs from like Home Depot or Lowe's or one of your hardware stores. And let me tell you, I actually went to Lowe's or Home Depot, I can't remember which one it was. I pulled out one of those rodent rack, one of those concrete mixing tubs that people are using, and let me tell you, they are super flimsy. And as a matter of fact, there's a lot of people where the rodents are actually eating through the tub and escaping in the house. And let me tell you, when I first got rodents and I started breeding hundreds and hundreds of rats, I'd have nightmares of the rodents getting out and running around my house. And you know how destructive they could be if they got out. They would chew up everything. It would be unbelievable if they actually got out. And some people actually, what they do on those concrete mixing tubs is they put in like duct tape and like screens, they glue on metal screens, and they're trying all this stuff to actually try to keep them from chewing through the tub. And I actually decided to go to a professional ARS rack. This is a professional rodent breeding rack that is sold by ARS Caging, and I kind of want to show you some of these tubs. So this is the tub that I breed my mice in, and look at how sturdy this tub is. You can't even like twist it. It's a sturdy, really sturdy tub, and I haven't seen any chew marks in the last few years since I've breeding rodents on any of these tubs. These will last forever, I would say. And then kind of my rats, I breed them in this bigger tub here. This is like my big, this is the rodent breeder tub. It's a pretty long tub. And then the really big tubs, I like these. Let me show you this really big tub over here. This is what I use for my my biggest tubs for my rats. These are really, and look at how heavy duty they are. You can't even hardly twist them at all. They are really super heavy duty, and there's no chew marks at all on any of these tubs. I really love these tubs. So what I'd actually do is if you actually decide, hey, this rack is way too expensive, I can't afford it, these are like thousands of dollars per rack, and you're thinking about doing it yourself, what I would actually do is I would go to ARS Caging and buy these tubs and then build your rack. A lot of people use like a 2x2 lumber and hardware cloth and stuff like that. I would actually use these tubs in a rack setup like that. And I've actually never seen anybody do that, where they have a really nice tub and then kind of a really cheap rack around it. But that's probably the route that I'd go. So that is another tip. And I kind of wanted to show you some of the stuff that's going on my rack. I've figured out having a problem with my water nozzles. It's one of the things that you really have to watch on this type of rack. As a matter of fact, I'd say probably the two biggest manufacturers of racks for the rodents is ARS Caging and Freedom Breeder. And I think both of them kind of have the pros and the cons. I'm not really affiliated with either one, so I'm just kind of giving my honest opinion as far as what I've seen. I haven't actually seen a Freedom Breeder up close where I can pull out the tub and look at it and see how sturdy the tubs are. But I know these tubs on the ARS are really strong. So I'd say on the Freedom Breeder, they have a better locking mechanism to lock the water nozzle in with the tubs. And on these, you really have to keep an eye on them because sometimes the rats will pop them out. And every day I kind of go through and look at all the water nozzles to see if they've been popped out. And so, actually, I had one where they popped out the water nozzle and it's stuck in the open position on top of the tub, and it actually flooded the tub and killed the rats. It was the first time I actually ever had anything like that happen where I killed the rats from this automatic water system. But the other thing that I like about the ARS Caging is that they actually sell these in individual levels, which is pretty cool. So if you're thinking, I don't want to spend over $1,000 for a rack, I just want to buy just a few tubs, you can actually buy just one level with just a few tubs. It won't break the bank, and you actually can start breeding right out of the chute. All right, so here are my two rodent racks in my reptile room, and I would say probably the biggest tip that I have for this is if you're having problems heating your reptile room, add some rats, because these guys put off an incredible amount of heat. So it is the middle of summer now, but we're up here in the mountains. It's probably never above 80 degrees up here in the mountains, usually in the 70s. My basement is actually almost always 70, and just having these rats in here with no heat at all, it's usually about 82 or 83. As a matter of fact, if I had more rats in here, I'd probably need an air conditioner because these guys put up so much heat. It's pretty incredible. If you're having heating problems and you can't afford to heat your house, maybe you could put rat racks through your whole house. That would be kind of an interesting thing to do. So as far as cleaning these rats, I have one quick tip. Usually what I do is I have one tub that doesn't have any rats in it. So when you're figuring out kind of how you're setting up all your breeder pairs and your rotation and everything, I was kind of taking into consideration, I have one that is completely empty. And essentially what I do is I just open one over here and I'll move the rats. I actually gently pick them up by the tail. I know some people say you shouldn't pick them up by the tail. I usually keep one pretty much closed, and then as these guys come up, I just gently move them over. It's really super easy to actually clean these. And I would say the hardest part is if a rat gets away. This is when your rats are going to get away, moving them from tub to tub. So that is essentially it. And then if they have any babies, I'll pick up the babies and I'll move them over. And the funny thing is on these, I actually have magnetic labels. These rats over here are actually retired females, and they're pretty much just kind of in holding. I don't really breed them, and I use them for my reticulated pythons, but I have quite a few that are just kind of hanging out that are pretty much just kind of retired. They've been breeding for a while, and then they get to the point where they don't produce, and I just kind of let them do whatever, and they're not really I guess they're kind of pets, I guess, at this point. I'm not really like die hard for making money over rats. Some of them are just kind of hanging out, living the rest of their life in my rat rack, which is kind of weird. So anyway, from here, what I do is I would dump my bedding into the garbage can, and then I'd spray it with like an F10, a diluted F10 spray. And then I basically have these clips on here to say, you know, if the clip is on here, I just cleaned these a couple days ago. It's been like 2 days. That's about as dirty as it gets. And I would say if you're breeding rats, you probably want to change out the bedding, spray down, and wash out the insides of the tubs maybe every 3 or 4 days if you really want to cut the smells to zero. Because it doesn't really smell in here after, you know, 2 or 3 days. But let me tell you, if you let this go to a week, I was actually cleaning once a week, and you can get some pretty bad, it kind of smells like more like urine, I guess. If you let it go too bad, it's sometimes if you let it go for more than a week, it can be unbearable. You really need to keep on top of cleaning your rodents. So that's probably the number one thing. All right, so one of the things I wanted to point out on these racks is the watering system, and I think a lot of people shy away from getting rodent racks like this because of failures of the water system. So essentially, you have a 5-gallon bucket up on top that's clear. You can actually see the water level here. So one of the things you have to check is the water level, and then it comes down through all these little hoses and nozzles, and this is essentially what activates. If you move the little thing right in the middle, it activates and dispenses the water. And I've actually had one of these where they popped it out and it landed on top of the enclosure here, and it actually activated open, and I came down here and the whole thing was flooded. Killed all the rats except one. It was kind of, you know, struggling in there. I actually saved one, but it was really unfortunate. So now every Christmas I go through and I buy them all new nozzles and make sure all the nozzles are working fine. And then I go through every single day, twice a day, and I kind of scan all the nozzles, make sure they're working okay. And the interesting thing is, this last time I went through and I changed all the nozzles, I bought them from Reptile Basics, and I found out that the mouse nozzles shouldn't be the same as the rat nozzles. So essentially what happens is when I opened up some of these tubs and looked in, these are my white mice, really cute, highly productive mice. These guys they produce like 16 to 20 babies per litter. Super productive. But the problem is with these nozzles, the adult mice can actually drink out of them, but the little hoppers can't drink out of the nozzles. So essentially what was happening was I'd look in there and all the little, as soon as they'd stop nursing the hoppers, they get really skinny and sickly looking. Sometimes I just lose a whole litter of hoppers. And then I started putting these water things in here, and then I found out, hey, that's what's going on, is they don't have enough water. They were going crazy over the water because I was running out. But the thing about these is these are really noisy. You can kind of hear them kind of chugging away on those little metal balls. So that's the problem. If you had a whole rack with all the water bottles, it'd drive you crazy, all the little balls kind of flopping around. So I actually found there's a valve you can use called a VeriFlow water valve, and it's essentially the same thing as this, except it's specifically made for a lighter pressure where hopper mice can actually activate it and get the water out of those nozzles. All right, so I kind of want to show you my new organization of my rats, and I would say most people, this is probably one of the most difficult things, and what most people do, I think, is in these bigger tubs, they'll use like 1 or 2 males to a whole bunch of females, and they'll really cram them in there, and then what they'll do is they'll slowly pull out the females as they get pregnant, and they'll move them over to these tubs to give birth, so they don't, you know, have any problems over here. So kind of what I've changed everything to do, I permanently keep my males and my females together all the time, and it's a little bit easier. It's still some work. So essentially what I do is I'll go through and I'll clean maybe like 3 levels every couple days. So I'll clean these 3 or 4 levels, and then the next day I'll clean these levels, next day I'll clean these, and then I kind of just move through. And it works really well because I have, essentially when I'm moving stuff around, culling for my snakes as food, and I'm kind of moving stuff around. So for example, this one has 1 male and 4 females, and you can see they have a whole bunch of different sized babies. And for example, this is kind of a smaller, like a crawler, I would say. But the problem is, if you keep them together all the time, they start having new babies on top of the old babies. So the problem, oh my goodness. So the problem is if they have babies that are maybe twice or 3 times as big as this, kind of crawling around here, and then they have a new litter of pinkies, usually the pinkies won't survive. So essentially what you have to do is you have to take out, what I would do is I would actually take out these pinkies and I would move them into another tub that has pinkies. And then if they have bigger babies, I'd move those bigger ones into here, or I would feed them to my snakes and kind of roll through them that way and just kind of move around the babies instead of moving around the males with the females. And I found that works a lot better, because if you take kind of a strange male and you put it with some females, especially if those females have babies. So for example, with these females and the babies, if I was to put a strange male in there, they would tear that male apart. It would be fighting big time. And that's what I found. If I'm moving males through my tubs, a lot of times I'd have a lot of really severe fighting from the males and the females not getting along. And this way, I pretty much raise them up together. I put the females in there until they get mature, and then I'll put a new male in there, and they will always stay together the entire time, and there's never any fighting between the males and the females. It's working great. And then if I want to raise them up to, for example, let's see, I have some males over here. So if I'm looking for, raising some up like bigger size, like this, to feed to my bigger snakes, essentially what I'll do is I'll keep pulling the pinkies out and then let the females raise the babies until they're big enough to go into like a male tub. And then once they're weaned, I bring them up over here, and then they're pretty much on their own in the male tubs, and I'll feed them off from there. And then I would say one danger is, so for example, if you took, well, it's obvious that these little babies in here, even the smaller ones, are really, they're really not, I would say these are definitely not weaned yet. But if they get to the point where they're bigger and their eyes are open and they're running around and they look like they're weaned, I would say you definitely don't want to wean them too early, because essentially what happens is, look at that crazy rat. Essentially what happens is if you move them over before they're weaned fully and you put them in a separate tub, they start looking really skinny and sickly, and that is an indication that you moved them over and they weren't fully weaned before you separate them from the moms. So I wanted to show you the back of one of these racks real quick, because this is essentially where all the food is, and right underneath the food is the screen, and they can actually just reach up there and eat the food. And the thing I really like about this is that there's no contamination of the food. So when I actually had glass aquariums and I put the food in little dishes, it would get soiled a lot, and they were always eating dirty food, and I'd throw the food away before they completely eat it. This really saves a lot of food. They eat pretty much 100% of the food all the time. I could fit like, I think 100, 150 pounds just in one rack. I could fit probably 300 pounds of food between these 2 racks, and it'll last a long time. With all these rats, I'd say I probably put in about 50 pounds, maybe 100 pounds a week. I go through quite a bit of food, about 100 pounds. And some people actually use dog food, but this is the Missouri. I think it's like one of the most scientifically blended foods that really makes your rats look really well over the long term. So another thing I'd highly recommend if you're getting racks like this, not only to keep one tub open so you can keep, it's easy to clean, you just move the rats over and then clean that tub, but also to get extra tubs. So essentially what I do is I'll take like these 4 tubs here, and then I'll fill them with bedding, and then, I'll kind of leapfrog these over until I have 4 or 5, and then I can clean them all at the same time. It's a lot easier than, trying to clean one at a time, because essentially essentially what you do is you spray them all down with the F10 or the bleach or whatever it is, and then you're spraying them all out. It just seems like it's a lot easier with a whole batch of tubs versus one at a time. Okay, so there you have it. Those are some tips for breeding rats, and I would say if you're thinking about breeding rats, you probably want to start small and get into it, see if you have what it takes to breed some rats. I've actually seen a video on the internet. Some guy bought a bunch of rats, bred them, and realized that, hey, I can't euthanize my rats. I just can't do it. And hey, that's part of the business. And I would say at that point, probably what you want to do is get out of the rat breeding business, or maybe you can transition over to selling pet rats instead of feeder rats for your reptiles, or you can sell those live feeder rats to the pet stores. You know, sometimes that works too. There's different ways you can approach it. And for me, I would think pretty much the big driving factor behind my rats is I've actually seen a lot of these big warehouse breeder of rats have problems with diseases, and the supply dries up and you don't have a place to get your rats. And in that case, I actually have rats in my rack, rats in my freezer. I have a really good supply of rats. It doesn't matter kind of what's going on out there as far as, you know, the supplier of the feeders for my snakes. So that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.